What Comes by Rebecca Lloyd. Martin and I were humbled by the age of the cottage, and intended to live in it just as we found it, imposing hardly anything of ourselves on it at all. We weren't going to paint out the yellowing distemper on the parlour walls, and the kitchen was to remain just as it was, with its rough wooden table, uneven flooring and stone sink. The floors upstairs sloped at crazy angles like a child's first discoveries in perspective. And on the ground floor there were deep nooks in the walls that Martin's mother thought would be perfect for small table lamps or vases. "Otherwise they're just black holes," she said, shadowy. "Or some nice glass ornaments, don't you think?" "We've left that kind of thing behind, Patricia," I said, without looking at her. "What kind of thing?" "Pared everything down, Mum. Fresh start," Martin said. "No clutter." I squeezed his hand and watched Patricia wince. "The family photographs, then," she suggested. "Surely you'll want those in here." "We're going to try and live simply, Mum. Kath's going to plant vegetables and keep hens." "Oh, good. You'll have something to eat, then." "And the light is wonderful. I know I'll be able to paint again here. We need a different kind of life now," he added quietly. "And what happens if you go off the rails again, Martin? I won't be here to help you, you know." "Martin's perfectly okay now, Patricia," I said, "and this is exactly where we want to be. And it'll be much better for the dogs out here as well." "Well, I don't suppose there's much you could do with it anyway. It's seedy, if you ask me. Seedy and dark and damp through and through." She was looking at Martin, but talking to me, a thing she did often that he could never see. "No one's been here for a long time, Mum. It's just unaired, not damp," Martin said, stooping to kiss her. "At least, other than that little patch above the back door." Patricia buttoned her coat up slowly and gazed at Martin as if he were a soldier about to leave for war in a distant land. "Well, you've made your bed, and now you've got to lie in it, I suppose," she murmured, glancing at me over his shoulder. "Can't see the attraction myself." She began her headscarf ritual, fingertips poking and tucking the slithery material until her face was surrounded by anchors and sailing ships. I began my mental countdown. In the past, she'd be gone before I reached 40. This time she lingered to 60, until Martin threw his arms around her once more and rocked her gently from side to side. "Don't forget me, Martin," she whispered. "How could I, Mum? I'll be working on your portrait all this summer," he said, as he walked her to the front door. I watched them through the parlour window. Martin lowered his head to hers, and they touched foreheads. Their private goodbye that shut out the rest of the world, and all that was in it. He stood outside with her for a long time, and when he returned through the tall weeds in the front garden, I dug my nails hard into my palms. "Patricia certainly puts things into perspective, doesn't she, Martin?" I began. "She's gone now, Kath, so let it be." I laughed. "Are you sure about that?" "Don't start that business again. You knew how she'd be. Just leave it alone. What I meant was that things are going to be hard here, like she said." "No, you didn't, Kath. You're trying to bring up all the old stuff. I've told you before. It makes my life a whole lot easier if I go along with her funny little ways." "Can't see the attraction myself. You did know she was referring to me, didn't you?" Martin shrugged. "We're miles away from her now. What more do you want?" "I just want you to see how things really are with her, Martin. You and her." "And do what about it, exactly?" We scarcely had any garden at the back of the cottage. Our boundary wall abutted the edge of the woods. It had the particular stillness that all ancient woods have, and except for the flitting of moths drawn to our kitchen light, We never saw or heard anything out there between the damp tree trunks. Our garden space was all at the front. I could see how I wanted it to look despite the vigorous tangle of weeds and bramble, and within a couple of weeks I had a lot of it cleared. Martin and I got along well for a while. We began to recall the little things that had made us laugh when we were first together, and the birds that sometimes woke us at dawn had a depth and sweetness in their song I'd never known before. I went for long walks with the dogs, and all the misery that had weighed on me so heavily while Martin was ill vanished. He was taking his medication regularly and painting again with his old intensity. He even left his studio door open so that I could walk in when I wanted to. I realized I was happy, and I didn't mind that he was only working on the portrait of his mother, because at least he was painting again, and there were no signs of his illness that I could see. No repetitions or jagged lines in his work. It's good, Martin. The features are right, and the angle of the head. Yeah, it's coming on. It'll be finished before autumn. There's just something missing that I keep glimpsing but can't pin down yet. An atmosphere, maybe, I said, carefully. Or something about the eyes, a particular way of gazing. The damp stain over the kitchen door was our only real problem. Martin studied it for a long time and finally decided to tackle it. But I was nervous about the idea of breaking through the old plaster. Won't it be made of weird stuff like horsehair and bits of lath? Would modern plaster stick there? I'm not sure, Kath, but you can see where it's damp on the outside as well. There's a kind of parting in the base of the thatch in the medieval layer, like a slit. My hand didn't want to go up there. He laughed. I suppose that's Freudian or something. I wasn't really paying attention. I'd found a newspaper lining from 1910 in the kitchen cupboard and was reading a gruesome article about rickets in East London. I was next aware of Martin when he tapped on the window. He was outside the back door in the tall grass. Come here a minute, Kath. There's something lodged in the slit. What he pulled out was a brown leather shoe, crudely stitched and well worn. It looked like a giant half-flattened chrysalis. One of the seams had split. The toe came to an exaggerated point, and the thing was damp and mildewy with a curious smell, acrid and fatty at the same time. There was a bulge on one side that I knew suddenly was the imprint of someone's bunion. I was repulsed by how personal the thing was, but the incongruity of its hiding place disturbed me more. It was akin to coming across human excrement in the doorway of a high street shop. Martin poked it with a stick. That's what's causing the stain on the wall, Kath. He turned to look at me. But it's got to go back. It looks as if it's as old as the cottage itself. You're joking. 15th, 16th century? About it going back, I mean. We should get a museum to collect it. I shouldn't have disturbed it. It needs to go back. What about the damp patch? He shrugged. We'll get a plasterer or something. Doesn't it repulse you, Martin? He didn't answer for a moment. I don't know what I feel about it. It reeks. How the hell did it get into the thatch? Oh, it's obvious, Kath. It was put there for a purpose. Our dogs wandered out through the kitchen door, but did not come to us. You're not putting it back, Martin. It's revolting. Throw it into the wood, can't you? Don't argue with me about this, Kath, he whispered. I'll put it back and we'll just forget about it. Let's see you pick it up then, in your bare hands. I touched his arm, and he pulled away slightly. Take the dogs for a walk, he said. Not in the woods. Take them to the field so they can run properly. He sounded so grave that I turned and left, without a word. By the middle of July, I had restored the beautiful stone path leading to the front gate. and pulled away the strange orange-coloured dodder that had smothered the old apple tree. I'd even nailed the plastic horseshoe Patricia had given us to the front door, as horrible as it was. About then, I began to notice a change in Martin. He was still working, but started closing his studio door, and I knew I'd be trespassing if I walked in. He'd become pale and restless, and said he was cold all the time. I looked out for signs of his illness, but his thoughts were coherent, and when I could persuade him to speak to me, our brief conversations were unremarkable. He wasn't talking to himself or making odd gestures. I checked his studio a couple of times when he was out with the dogs, but he hadn't painted symbols on the floor, and he was working on with the portrait carefully. There was nothing peculiar about it. He'd been phoning his mother a lot, but all I could ever hear were single words. I tried to break the tension that had arisen between us. "How's your mother doing, Martin?" "Same as ever." "Has she bought anything new recently?" "Silk curtains. More of them." He shrugged. "She likes them. What are you getting at?" "Nothing at all, Martin. I was just trying to have a normal conversation with you." "You're not talking to me." "Is it material you want to talk about, or my mother?" "I haven't mentioned her for weeks, have I?" "No. I thought you might be missing it." "Martin, why are you being like this? What's wrong?" He stood up and went to the window seat. I could see his silhouette against the evening sun, but not his expression. "What's done is done," he declared. "Well, what's done?" I asked him. "This is our new start. Let's not foul everything up again." "I'm worried about that stain. It's flecky and a bit pronounced now. Get rid of the filthy shoe, and let's get the roof mended and a plasterer in." "I think it's too late." He raised his hand to stop my reply. "There's a woman living in the twisty lane behind the post office who has a pair of shoes on a stool by her front door. I've walked past her place with the dogs, and the shoes are always there. And she's very old, the kind of old that makes you catch your breath. I've been to see her. She said it would have been more worrying if the shoe hadn't been hidden there in the thatch." I remembered when Martin had pulled the thing out. He was wincing as he did it, and as he realized what it was, he let it fall from his hands onto the path. The stench of it hit us at the same time, and we stepped back from it abruptly. He reckoned the smell was something to do with the tanning process they used in those days, then added that medieval people smelt to high heaven as well. "So, according to Twisty Lane woman, you were right to put the thing back?" I asked. "I don't know, Kath. Her name's Mrs. Overton. She said if the shoe hadn't been there, she'd have felt very sorry for us." "What else did she say?" "Nothing that made sense. Just a bit of local folklore." "Well, are you going to let me in on it or not, Martin?" He shook his head and walked past me. "No, I'm going to sit in the kitchen for a while and read, if that's okay by you." "Don't you think you should phone your mother first and get permission?" I said. He didn't respond, and I felt lousy and angry with myself. The following day, I went to Mrs. Overton's cottage. It took her a long time to come to the door, and while I waited, I inspected the shoes. Black brogues from the 1930s, I thought, worn out and without laces. She couldn't see me very well when she opened the door. I shifted slightly and bent my knees a bit. "My husband and I are new here," I told her, "and we're curious about your shoes. The ones on the stool," I added as she looked down at her feet. She gazed at me as if I'd said something silly. "Lucky shoes to keep out what would come," she announced, and began to close the door. I realized then that I'd disturbed her in sleep. I should have left quietly, but instead I reached out and gripped the door handle. What would come? I asked. She tried to see me better by moving her head from side to side. Nothing has over all the years I've been in the village. Not to me, anyway. Yes, but what? I can't answer that. But you'd soon know if it did. I've explained it all to Mr. Parker. Let him tell you. I just want to know what would come, I whispered. Mr. Parker's been here 3 times now bothering me, she said. It's his business to tell you. She pulled on the door suddenly, and I had to let it go. Something to do with luck, I told Martin that evening while we ate. And something that comes. Is that all she told you, Kath? She said to ask you, said you knew about it. Martin stared at me. Well, that's fine then. Let's just forget it now. Where are you going to put the chicken coop? At the back, outside the kitchen. But I don't want to discuss chickens with you, Martin. I want the shoe gone. It makes me feel queasy knowing it's there. Yeah, but you aren't going to put it out yourself, are you? You want me to do it? Well, you found it. Doesn't it disturb you? Every time I have to go into the kitchen, I think about it. Kath, we can't be the first to have discovered it. It's barely concealed. Think of all the people who've lived in this cottage through the centuries. Nobody's touched it. And nor will you. What did Mrs. Overton tell you? Hard to say, really. Hard for you to say, you mean? I bit down onto my lip. He blinked at me and said nothing further. But when I fled the room, he followed me. At the front gate, he put his arm around my shoulder. Dusk had fallen, and the old road shifted with moving shadows. I leant against him and shivered. What comes, Martin? How would I know? Because you talked to her properly. He moved slightly, as if I'd suddenly become heavy. It's just one of those weird old superstitions. You're doing it again, Martin. Not telling me things. I was silent for a moment. How many times did you visit her? Once. She said you'd been there 3 times. I looked straight at him and watched his face change. All I'm asking is that you stop being secretive. What did the woman say? She said it was nothing unusual around these parts. Couldn't you learn to live with the shoe, Kath? I looked back at the cottage. Apart from anything else, the stain has started to spread. Or haven't you noticed? He laughed. I thought it was me who was supposed to be the mad one. He pulled me closer to him. There isn't room for 2 loonies in our cottage. I went to look at that stain the other night. It's darkened and grown. Things always look different at night, don't they? That's what darkness is for, isn't it? So it's my imagination, then. All right, Kath. She said that what comes can be lured into a shoe that holds iron. You saw the rust in it when we pulled it out. Just suppose for a moment that something was captured, and I accidentally released it. That's ridiculous. There you are, then. Why insist on knowing? Look, Kath, Mum thinks we shouldn't tamper with it either. She says we should sell up and move back to town. Does she now? I suppose she's known about all this right from the beginning. I wanted to punch him. Instead, I banged the garden gate open and walked quietly down the road, into the tightening darkness. I heard him call out once, but the roaring sound in my head made his voice faint. On the evening before I'd gone to see Mrs. Overton, I'd had some whiskey. I stood for a moment in the parlour, then made for the kitchen. The stain had spread down the wall by about a foot in delicate extensions of itself that seemed like purposeful, exploratory creeping. There was something mesmerizing about it. and for a brief while I could not free myself from the notion that it was sentient. I wondered if it was possible to make something innocent become hideous, just by the power of your own feelings. As I stared at it, it occurred to me that Martin had not been sitting in the kitchen over the past weeks to avoid me, but to study the thing. By the end of August, the stain had flourished. The blurred edges had sharpened, and it had become detailed in the corner where the two walls meet on one side of the back door. There'd been no rain. Everywhere was as dry as tinder. The tall grass at the back was full of crickets, yet the stain was creeping downwards. Neither of us were sleeping, and our days were foggy and muddled. We took to walking with the dogs together in silence, taking our fear with us like a stalker. I kept wondering if we'd created the whole thing ourselves, if we'd fed off each other's irrationality without realizing it, until we'd conjured up something as real to us as solid matter, as real as our car, our dogs, our own hands. I chose an evening when Martin seemed less agitated. I found him standing in the kitchen, staring out into the woods. Normal people would have dealt with it, I said. How are we not normal? Martin glanced up at the thing, looked away quickly. Or do you mean me? The stain had grown intricate, with peculiar branching tendrils, and there was intensity in the central bulk of it, light and shade, and a suggestion of muscular form. It had developed into something resembling a glowering etching, full of subtlety and power. I sat down at the table. Look at the thing with me, Martin. He had his back to me, but I saw him stiffen. Where are the dogs? I'm going to take them for a walk. They're in the hall. You know they won't come into the kitchen, but you've just been out with them, haven't you? He didn't move. Kath, I think we should sell up. Things don't feel right here. I want us to look at it together, I said. He turned sharply towards me, and as he did so, he couldn't help seeing the thing for a second. I look at it every day, Kath. I know every inch of it, every filthy, perverted curve of it. Maybe it's you who needs to look harder. What do you think it is? I stared straight ahead and waited, conscious of the dark and vivid wetness high up to my right. Martin shifted then and came to sit beside me. Could be anything. I don't see the point in looking at it together. It doesn't smell like mould, I said. It smells of something, though, Martin answered. Nothing I've ever smelt before. It smells of meat, Martin. I thought if we could agree about it, we'd know what to do. There's nothing left to do, Kath. I spent whole nights wondering how things would have turned out if I hadn't insisted on putting the shoe back. What did the woman say, Martin? Why can't you tell me properly? I was trying to care for you, Kath. Make up for what's gone before. You were sick before. You couldn't help it. Yes, but you don't know what it's like for me, looking at that thing and thinking I must be sick again. Tell me what Mrs. Overton said, Martin. Trust me. Nobody who's been where I've been ever truly trusts people again, he murmured. Except their mothers, I thought. I took hold of his hand, and it was heavy and clammy. I just want to be in on things. That's all. Mrs. Overton said all kinds of shoes have been concealed for as long as anyone can remember. In manor houses, barns, cottages, churches. Men do the concealing, apparently. She didn't know why. A whore's slipper was found embedded in a cathedral wall once. He paused for a moment and glanced at the stain quickly. I suppose that's not so strange, he whispered, the thought of using a hall's slipper as a trap. A trap for what? Anything you have the ability to imagine. That's just a meaningless riddle. What's supposed to come? He hesitated. What comes is what most has a hold on you. Well, what's come to us is an ugly stain, I whispered. Unless you think it's something else. Do you think it's something else, Kath? I don't know. What do you see when you look at it? He turned his head slightly and squinted as if to filter the sight of the thing through some imaginary lens. There's something familiar about it, but I can never quite recognize it. So, what do you see? I could hear my own voice. There was a tremor in the pitch of it. Something intentional. That's all I can say. What do you see? Something predatory. I felt hot and cold at the same time, and I kept my eyes on the pale moths trembling outside in the dark against the kitchen window. It's only taken a week for the lower limbs to become as defined as they are now, I whispered. What's going to happen when it reaches the floor, do you think? I've been wondering about that. Where do you sense the head's meant to be? Don't you know? You can see the imprint of it if you look hard enough. But we're never going to see it fully, are we? It's always going to be under that slithery covering. Is it male or female for you, Kath? I've never thought about it like that. I just keep wondering what's going to happen when it reaches the floor. Martin turned his head properly then, and looked at the stain directly. It was captured once, and now we've freed it, I finished for him. We left the kitchen abruptly and went straight upstairs. I'd imagined that talking about it would force us to think more rationally. Instead, it had compounded our fear, and I wished to God I hadn't forced the issue. I was ready to leave the cottage now. Everything about it was tainted. When I woke the next morning, Martin was not beside me. I wondered if he'd gone in the night, gone to his mother. I couldn't hear the dogs. I walked out onto the landing and looked through the tiny leaded window, and our car was still on the road. I didn't want to go downstairs. And when I did, I went slowly and brimming with fear. Before I set foot in the dark little kitchen, Martin called out, "It's gone, Kath! Come and look!" The walls around the door were white again. Where the stain had been, there was nothing. The dogs were lying at Martin's feet, and he looked stranger than I had ever seen him. Shrunken, yet elated and glittery somehow. "Last night I made up my mind we should leave," I told him. "Go and stay with Patricia until we found somewhere else." "So did I. Stay with Mum, but there's no need. She's gone, and we can live now," he said, pointing at the bare, white wall. We started eating our meals in the kitchen again, although it took us a while to resist the temptation to glance at the wall every so often. It was only now that we realized how deeply the dogs had been affected. Their quiet watchfulness had gone, and they wandered freely in and out of the kitchen and lay together on the back step. I was waiting for my Rhode Island Reds. The chicken coop was finished, and I was glad I'd found a good use for the rough piece of ground at the back. "So, Kath, we can get on with things at last," Martin said. "We just got badly frightened and couldn't get ourselves out of it. When Mum comes for the portrait, I want her to see we're happy. We are happy, aren't we?" I studied his face. He looked relaxed and his colour was good. "Okay, Kath, one last hurdle for you, I know, but just stay in the background. She's not going to be here long." "Are you pleased with the painting, Martin?" I asked. "I'm glad it's finished. It's a fair likeness. Mum will be happy anyway." "Was it difficult?" "At times. Portraiture's an odd business. Very introverted. Now I'll be able to get down to some real work at last." I remembered the abstracts he'd done in hospital, the garish violence of them, and the crazy symmetrical repeating patterns. He sensed my thought. "No, Kath, my early landscapes, that's the work I've got to get back to. Not my descent into hell." Patricia came to collect the painting on a bright autumn day when the wind was high and white clouds moved quickly across the sky, making shadows on the landscape. I remember thinking them beautiful. It was the last time I've seen beauty since. When she arrived, she wanted to see the painting straight away. I stayed in the kitchen. I could hear them talking above me in the studio. "It doesn't really do you justice, Mum," Martin said. "Oh, you're wrong, darling. It's perfect, and I love it. It's just like your old work." I was a bit afraid. Martin laughed. "You shouldn't worry so much, Mum. Everything's fine now." "So you've decided to stay here after all? After what you told me? Sometimes you were in tears. I used to lie awake at night wishing I could come to you. We just got carried away, me and Kath both. When you've been where I've been, you never quite trust reality again. You might not want to hear this, but Kath and I went through something together at long last, and that's what cleared everything up." "I never knew what to imagine. I was so afraid you were sick again. Sometimes I even thought of speaking to her about it." "Why didn't you, Mum?" "I'd never do something behind your back, darling. Talk to a stranger. Anyhow, you're looking really good, and I'm just happy that thing hasn't returned." "Schizophrenia, you mean?" Don't use that nasty word, Martin, please. It was just a harmless little breakdown." I heard the floorboards creak as they moved away from the window. Martin took Patricia outside to the front garden, and it was only when they came round the side of the cottage to look at the chicken coop that I left the kitchen. I went up to the studio. I'd seen the work more than once in its early stages. It had been his mother those weeks back, and there had been light sitting behind her sitting figure then. He placed her in front of the large window in her dining room, and painted the sea-green fall of her curtains, and the distant scents of trees, the warm tones of the room. The rose colours of the wall in sunlight had been present behind her. He'd been working on her clasped hands, and I know I'd stared at the puffy whiteness of her face, the curious unsettling twist of her lips, the dog-like jut of her jawline. I could hear their voices below me by the chicken coop, and Patricia's sudden, bleating laughter. I turned my eyes away from the painting, and stared at the heavy floorboards, but nothing had changed when I looked back again. I'd have given anything at that moment to be staring at Martin's dissociated, jagged geometry, the hysterical language of his madness. All healthy colour had left the painting. There were no muted greens and reds. No sense of sunlight and trees I'd seen before. It was instead, in perfect detail, what Martin and I had lived with and dreaded for so long. I heard an echo of his voice. "You see the imprint of the head if you look hard enough. You see the imprint of the head if you look hard enough." Beneath the careful layers of sooty grey brushstrokes, tinged with dead yellow, he'd captured perfectly the angle of the shrouded head, the faint imprint of feathers within, and I could sense again the manifestation of something sentient, emerging slowly from the filmy layers of unnatural light and pools of darkness. Today's story was What Comes by Rebecca Lloyd. It was read by Jasper L'Estrange. If you enjoy the show and would like to support me, there are several ways you can do so. You can make a one-off donation through Ko-fi. You can join as a YouTube channel member or become a patron on Patreon and make a monthly contribution, gaining access to exclusive content. Liking, commenting, sharing and subscribing all help the channel grow. Thank you for listening, and until next time, sweet dreams.